Hi everyone. So what we're going to do with this video is we're going to go further into the spiral of becoming and look at the biochemical components to your fear response system. Now remember, the spiral of becoming is that depiction of how every moment of every day we're becoming something, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. And again, the spiral of becoming is just kind of a graphic interpretation of how that happens. It all starts with our perception. You've read a lot about perception, and I've talked about a lot how perception happens. And then the moment we have any kind of perception, and again, some of that is in our awareness, some of that is beyond our awareness, we immediately make meaning. And again, some of that meaning is even beyond our awareness. And then the moment we make any kind of meaning or interpretation of what we're perceiving, then we have physiological imprint of that moment. And this goes on every moment of every day, every moment of our lives. And then again, what we're doing now is we're kind of really pulling apart each of those the pieces of the physiological imprint. And again, you have a neural imprint of the moment, you have a biochemical imprint of the moment, and you also have an electrical imprint of the moment. And then the big piece here is that every time you have any kind of physiological imprint, because you are a system of adaptation, then you further perceive and transform into what that physiological imprint is. In other words, you become more capable of any experience that you routinely have. And so what we're doing now is we're breaking down each of the components, the physiological components of that imprint. What we're going to do first is we're going to really kind of get deeper into what your biochemical components look like when your fear response system has run rampant. So again, what we're looking at is the biochemical components of your fear response system. And again, so what we're going to do, I'm just going to draw the brain here. I know I'm not a great artist, but so if I were looking to the side and you cut my brain in half, this is kind of sort of what it would look like. And then again, I talk a lot about the inside and the outside of the brain, because remember, the outside of the brain is what's called your cortex. This is the part of your brain that is responsible for processing information. Processing information like storing knowledge, storing learned information, being able to recall information that you know. The limbic system is the part on the inside here, and the limbic system is the part of your brain that is mostly associated with emotion, but it also it provides meaning. It gives meaning to any context that we have. So what we talk a lot about in stress management is the importance of the inside of the brain. Now, I've talked a lot about the amygdala. Again, the amygdala is your perception center as far as emotional perception goes, and that's where every experience of our life is stored. I've talked a lot about the amygdala. Very close to the amygdala is something called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is like a chemical producing factory. So what happens when you get stressed out? What are the biochemical components when you get stressed out? Again, your amygdala is the thing that immediately perceives and immediately makes meaning of that perception. And it almost makes meaning of that perception always in terms of the amount of threat that that perception poses. So in other words, if I have all kinds of stuff stored in my amygdala from my past experience, it's just in wiring, and so that I face something in my immediate circumstance, it just gets processed through my brain, through my amygdala. It goes through all that wiring stored there, and then my amygdala makes a match of something that I've experienced before, and it tells me kind of my level of threat to perceive. Okay, so when we're stressed out, again, we may perceive a level of threat that has to do with paying a bill, and we may perceive a level of threat that has to do with any relational thing that might look like something that has posed us a problem in the past. We might perceive threat for academic anxiety, test anxiety. I mean, it runs the gamut. Anything that we're perceiving in our experience, in our immediate environment, is getting processed through that amygdala, and it's telling us how to make meaning in terms of the threat level. Again, this is how it works in your fear response system. Your amygdala also has a role in your calm and connection system, which we'll talk about later, but this is just in your fear response system. So then what happens is immediately your amygdala sends a message to your hypothalamus. Now your hypothalamus is like your chemical producing factory in your brain. That, along with your pituitary, which is also very close, both produce chemicals, and those start off your whole stress response. So what happens is your amygdala perceives threat. It sends an immediate message to both the hypothalamus and pituitary, and they produce a hormone called ACTH. Now, ACTH is called adrenocorticotropic hormone. The way you can break that down is adreno, again, is for adrenaline, which I'll talk about in a minute. Cortico is for cortisol. Well, hormone is anything in your body that just does something. Again, we hear a lot about sex hormones, and hormones are just there. We have a lot of hormones besides just our sex hormones. Hormones are biochemicals that go throughout your body, and they kind of are responsible for doing some job. So our stress hormones are responsible for creating our stress response. What happens is your hypothalamus produces ACTH, and then what happens is that ACTH gets sent down to, this is not a, I mean, it starts in the brain, but it's not a brain thing. So you have your kidneys here. Sitting on top of your kidneys are your adrenal glands. And this is just kind of in the small of your back, actually. And your adrenal glands are what start it all off. So in your adrenal glands, this is where all your stress hormones are produced. Okay, the original producing hormone is produced in your brain, but that's just the thing that starts the process. That's not the most damaging hormone. So what happens is your adrenal glands produce adrenaline, or what we call epinephrine. And then they also produce something called cortisol. Now, adrenaline is a really quick acting hormone. It's like if you have we have an earthquake and you get really scared quick and your heart races, but then it kind of calms down pretty quick. So adrenaline in itself isn't usually bad, but I mean, it can be if you already have significant heart disease. It could be because what it does is mobilizes fatty acids in your blood. And so if it mobilizes fatty acids in your blood and you already have a restriction in some of your blood vessels, then it could actually precipitate a heart attack. That's why they tell you at like Magic Mountain, don't get on the right if you have heart problems. But typically, if you don't already have some heart disease, adrenaline is like that quick shot, make you really kind of hyper alert very quickly, but then it typically dissipates pretty quickly. Cortisol is a different thing. Cortisol is a long-acting hormone. It has a 12-hour half-life, which I will tell you about what that means in a minute. But what happens is that adrenaline and cortisol go all over your whole body. Okay. So again, the perception starts in your brain. It gets sent to your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus produces the ACTH, but then that gets sent down to your adrenal glands, which release the stress hormones all over your body. And what happens is it goes a lot of really important places. First of all, every cell and every organ has receptor sites for various biochemicals. And again, biochemicals are just what they sound like. They're just chemicals that go throughout your whole body, not just your brain, they go throughout your whole body. Every cell and every organ in your body has receptor sites for various biochemicals. The biochemical influence of emotion is huge. So a couple really important things that happen where that cortisol goes, number one, it goes back to your brain. It causes something called cortical inhibition. Inhibition means your brain can't function. This cortical stands for cortex right here. So what that means, cortical inhibition means that your brain, because remember your cortex is responsible for retrieving information. Cortical inhibition means it can't do its job. It's like this is why when you sit down to take a test and you can't remember what you know, it's because you have cortical inhibition. You have the information there. It's just when cortisol is flooding your brain, you can't retrieve the information that you know. Then you walk out of the room, your body calms down, your cortisol reduces, and all of a sudden you can remember everything that you couldn't remember during the test. It's also why, like, if you get in a car accident, all of a sudden you can't remember your phone number. Cortical inhibition means that it's just inhibiting your capacity to be able to recall information that you know. You know how that happens sometimes when your brain just gets so fuzzy and you can't remember what you know. That's cortical inhibition. Cortisol has been, first of all, we need so much cortisol to get out of bed in the morning. Cortisol in itself is not a bad hormone. It's a necessary hormone. We need cortisol to keep us functioning. We need cortisol to get us out of bed in the morning. But with our current society, most of us have way too much cortisol, unrelenting cortisol, too much, too often, and it wreaks havoc. Cortisol is associated with premature aging. It's associated with high body fat, with high blood sugar, high blood pressure, and it goes on and on and on. I mean, we have all kinds of problems. I always say, if you want to look at the effects of cortisol, look at a president when they come in office. A picture of a president when they come in office, and look at a picture of them 4 years ago. It looks like they've aged 20 years. That's the effect of cortisol. So cortisol in itself is, again, we need it enough to get out of bed in the morning, but most of us, because we're perceiving threat so much now in our current society, unrelenting stress, that we have way too much cortisol way too often, and it begins to wreak havoc on our brain and on our body. So, and again, one of the major also things that it does is cause cortical inhibition. So, and then the other thing that happens is the cortisol goes all over your body. So it goes, when you feel stressed out and you feel it through your whole body, it's because it's going throughout your whole body. One of the things that happens, again, it goes back to your cortex, so you can't remember, you can't process information. This is where we have higher level processing. It also goes back to your amygdala, which starts this whole feedback loop of stress all over again, because it goes back to your amygdala, and your amygdala senses threat, so it produces more of ACTH, and it's just this continual feedback loop of stress unless we begin to change what's going on. Now, a lot of what we've been talking about throughout this semester is that you are a system of adaptation. And I've said many, many times that every moment of every day you are transforming, whether you know it or not, or whether you like it or not. What we've been doing is talking about the spiral of becoming, how that all happens, specifically today about biochemically, how you become, what happens to your biochemical system, specifically in relationship to cortisol, as your fear response system is dominant. Remember, you have two systems that can be dominant. One is your fear response system, one is your calm and connection system. They have two completely different spirals. One or the other system is always dominant. The system that you are in more often than not is the system that becomes more dominant, and basically is the system that begins to kind of permeate the rest of your life. So we've been talking about your fear response system and what happens biochemically when you're rooted in your fear response system. So now what we're going to do is talk about how you begin to adapt. If you are in your fear response system under the influence of cortisol too long, too often, unrelenting, then you actually begin to adapt to being in that state, so you just get better at doing that. A couple of the things that happen, again, so this is your brain here, and we're going down, and these are your kidneys, and these are your adrenal glands. And remember, it all starts with the hypothalamus sending ACTH down to your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands release adrenaline and cortisol, and that goes all over your whole body. Well, one of the things that in your adrenal glands here, they make cortisol through corticotropic cells. So one of the things that happens, one of the adaptations that happens, is that if your body is too flooded with cortisol too often, then again, your body is always adapting to what it thinks you need, so it thinks you need to just make more cortisol. So one of the things that it does is it actually makes more adrenocorticotropic So it just makes more cortisol producing cells. In other words, you're stressed out, your body thinks, okay, I must need to be more stressed out, so I'm just going to make more cells to make more cortisol. That's a pretty serious adaptation. You're just making the capacity to make more cortisol. One of the things the other thing that happens is, say this is a regular cell in your body, the way that biochemicals get into a cell is they actually they get in by a receptor site, and they kind of lock into that receptor site and then perform kind of functions inside the cell. The biochemical is specific to the receptor site. In other words, only cortisol can get into cortisol receptor sites. So how many receptor sites you have around a cell is a pretty big deal. And one of the other things that happens if you have too much circulating cortisol out here, your body actually just makes more receptor sites to get more cortisol into the cell. That's called upregulation. So basically, that your body makes more receptor sites for a specific biochemical. Now, some biochemicals downregulate, some upregulate. They're all different in what happens. Sometimes if there's too much of an outside biochemical, your body says, oh my gosh, I don't want any more of that, and it actually will downregulate receptor sites. That's not true for cortisol. Cortisol will actually upregulate receptor sites to get more cortisol into the cell. So they're just basically, again, just making more receptor sites just to get more cortisol into the cell. One of the big things that happens is that there's a field called epigenetics. And epigenetics actually tells us that biochemicals can actually change the way a gene is expressed. So in other words, we used to think that what, you know, if you had a genetic component for something, that was it. The genes just determined your biology. And now we know that's not true. Now we know that certain genes are activated or deactivated by the cortisol that or the biochemicals that they're exposed to. One really good example of that is we all have something called a 5-HTT cert gene. The cert stands for serotonin transporter. Serotonin is a happy chemical. If you are on antidepressants or you know somebody on antidepressants, most of the time they are targeted at trying to give you more circulating serotonin. Not all the time now, there's some dopamine-based ones. But basically, serotonin is a neurotransmitter in your brain that is responsible for making you feel good. So 5-HTT cert is actually a gene that was discovered that if you had, there was a short form and a long form of that gene, and it was discovered that people that most often succumb to anxiety or anxiety disorders or depression or depressive disorders actually had that short version of the gene. And it was a huge, huge, huge finding in neuroscience, because it was like, you know, they actually found what they thought was a genetic predetermination for anxiety, stress disorders, depression. So it was a huge finding in science, but no pun intended, it was kind of pretty depressing for some people that were suffering from those disorders. Fortunately, they went on and did more research, and what they were finding was that some people had this short form of the gene, but were living fine, and they weren't getting stress disorders. And what they found that was what was making that gene activated, and by activated I mean kind of expressing itself in anxiety, depression, stress disorders, was the amount of cortisol that it was that impacted the gene. So it was actually activated, so it was, you know, kind of performing its function in anxiety and depression through the cortisol it was exposed to, because some people had that short form of the gene and were living fine. So that was even a bigger finding. So we found that some, you know, there was a genetic component. However, that genetic component really wasn't the determining factor. What was the determining factor was how much cortisol was exposed to. And then the third really big, well, there's two more big pieces. The third big piece was that if the cortisol was taken away, in other words, if there was some kind of intervention program or some kind of program where people were stopping their influx of cortisol, intentionally stopping their influx of cortisol, could be as simple as some of the tools and techniques you've been learning in this class, but when they were routinely stopping their influx of cortisol, that gene actually recovered. So it wasn't set in stone. It wasn't, in other words, you know, if you've had a bad experience in your life and you were exposed to cortisol and that gene got activated, so what, you know, sorry, but that's the way it is. And they found that that wasn't true. In fact, the people that responded the most to intervention programs were people that had this gene, and they, once the cortisol was stopped through some kind of intentional way of being different, not going in the same spiral, was that they actually recovered, which was a huge finding. So again, it's not necessarily your genes, it's not even the cortisol that turns on the genes. If you did anything to intervene and intentionally change your behavior, then the cortisol drastically dropped, and that gene, the genetic component, actually recovered, or the gene actually recovered from being expressed in that way. Now, the even bigger piece that they found through research was that it wasn't necessarily one big influx of cortisol. In other words, you know, a traumatic experience or a really hard experience, although those were important, and I'm not diminishing those at all. What they found was what the kind of cortisol influx that really activated that gene, again, expressing in depression or anxiety, was what we call low-grade cortisol baths. Low-grade cortisol baths are little influxes of cortisol all day long. Imagine you have an IV bag on your arm, and every time you have a thought, you're just squishing that IV bag and giving a little shot of cortisol through your body. And so that's exactly what they found. Low-grade cortisol baths are actually your thought process. So every time you have a thought, a negative thought or a harmful thought, or you're replaying the hard stories in your head, or I mean, we have, again, between 60 and 80,000 thoughts a day, and somewhere between 80% of them, 80 to 90% of them are negative, and some of them, somewhere between 80 to 90% of them are repetitive. And so what they found was that it was really the low-grade cortisol baths that were setting off that again, genetic tendency towards anxiety, depression, stress disorders. What does that all mean? It means your thought process all day long, every day matters, hugely matters. Last week we did paying attention to attention, and I hope that you could realize where your attention is in various different moments of the day, and again, how much that matters, how much just where your attention is matters, because those are what the low-grade cortisol baths are. And again, I'm not talking about suppressing, because your body responds to your authentic experience. So suppressing doesn't work. Pretending you're feeling something you don't doesn't work. Positive thinking, if you don't believe it, doesn't work. So the question is, how do we begin to change authentic experience, to begin to shift that spiral in a positive direction? And again, that's where we're going to be going, like next week and on from there. But just for a few minutes here, I want to give you kind of an example of what a low-grade cortisol bath was kind of like for me. And this is way, way, way beyond before I knew better, before I knew about this stuff. But I'm just going to tell you a brief story. Okay, so this was at a time before I knew all of this stuff, obviously, as you'll see this, and I was at a job. It was a different job where I had a very, very toxic department chair. We all know people like that. He was so bad he ended up getting fired a year after being hired. But we all know people like that are just full of really difficult energy for us. And like I said, he was so bad he got fired in a year after starting that job. But it was also at a time where I was in danger of losing a program that I had worked really hard to build, and because of budget cuts, it was in danger of being canceled. So I was carrying some stress around all of that anyway. And again, this is all before I learned all of this stuff, and it was it was a really hard time because I didn't deal well with my stress at that time because I didn't know any better. So let's just pretend. So remember that cortisol has a 12-hour half-life. And what that means is after 12 hours, it only takes half as much as the original dose to get you back up to the original, the level of the original upset. So it only takes half as much cortisol 12 hours later to get you up to that original level of upset. So it stays in your body for a long time, and you just need a little bit more to keep bouncing you back up to the top. So let's say it's 8 a.m. and I run into my department chair in the office, and he is his usual self, full of toxic energy, and my cortisol goes through the roof. So let's say this is cortisol here, this line is cortisol level, and this line is time. And so and my cortisol goes through the roof. One conversation. And so I start walking away. But as I walk away, it's not like I just walk away and be okay. It's like, oh my gosh, I should have said this. Guess what? Low-grade cortisol bath, shot of the IV cortisol all through my body. And then I start walking away and just start calming down. And then I replay the conversation. And then I start walking in. Next time I'm going to say this. And then I start walking away. And then I see a colleague. And do you know what just happened? And so all day long I'm replaying the story. I'm judging what I'm going to say next time all day long. I'm carrying it in my brain. I'm carrying it in my body. I'm repeating the experience. I'm sure that this experience is going to happen next time. So all day long, it's like I'm just giving myself shots of cortisol all day long, just recalling, replaying, that inner chatter in your brain. Because see, the thing is your brain doesn't realize the difference between something that's vividly imagined or something that's real. So all those conversations that you play in your head all day long, all the inner chatter that you tell yourself all day long, your brain receives those messages as if it were true. So in my example here, my brain was receiving those messages as I was having that experience over and over and over. Instead of being one experience for 5 minutes in the morning, my brain was perceiving that I was having that experience all day long every day. So I start coming home, and then I see my husband, and I want to tell him about my day. But the truth is, so processing to let go of something is really important. But that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the drama queen. I wanted him to feel sorry for me. So I take 20 minutes to tell him an event that happened 5 minutes in the morning. And again, it only takes half as much cortisol 12 hours later. Now my cortisol is through the roof for something that happened for 5 minutes in the morning, just because the low-grade cortisol baths, the way that I've been holding it, the way I've been replaying it in my brain all day long. So what happens is I finally go to sleep, finally start coming home, and guess what? 8 o'clock the next morning, I run into him, my department chair again. What I was doing is I was carrying 24 hours of cortisol all day long, every day. It was a super, super, super stressful time in my life. And the truth is if I would have learned how to deal with it right then, I would have saved myself 23.5 hours of cortisol all day long, every day. Now, I'm not saying again suppress, but if that moment I could have said a couple things. I could have said, okay, this is something really important. I need to deal with it, and really deal with it. Right? I would have saved all of this cortisol. Or I could have said, you know what, I really need to go back and I need to make it through my day of work. So I promise myself, and this is the all important promise. I promise myself I will go back and deal with it at an appropriate time, and then free myself up to be with my day the rest of my day, instead of doing this with my day all day long, right? Or talk to somebody and really talk in a way that I'm releasing and processing and letting go and figuring out how to deal with it, rather than just replaying the story and trying to be the drama queen. I had a lot of different options. I didn't take those options. What I took were the options of the low-grade cortisol baths. And again, from all that research I talked about earlier, it's the low-grade cortisol baths that make us most susceptible to all the damage that cortisol does to us, all the adaptations, making more cells to make more cortisol, making more receptor sites to make more cortisol, even changing a genetic expression of a gene. That's pretty big. And again, most of those adaptations, the worst influx of those adaptations are the low-grade cortisol baths, or the things that we tell ourselves all day long, every day. So again, last week you looked at your power of attention. I want you to think about how your power of attention and what your inner chatter is saying all day long, every day. And the idea here is not to suppress, but the idea here is to learn how to be able to change. We've put this all in the context of the spiral of becoming. Where we're going next is now, how do you begin to switch up that spiral so it works for you instead of against you?